Good morning, everyone. Today we have a spectacular webinar on stop, don't sign that waiver unless it says this. Leora is very excited. She's going to be presenting with Alex this morning. So I'm Ariella Wagner. I'm the founder of SunRay Construction Solutions. We help thousands of general contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers secure their lien and bond claim rights. And without further ado, I'll introduce the fabulous Alex Barthet.
Thanks, Ariel. It's hard to compete with Leora, that's for sure. My name is Alex Barthet. I am a board certified construction attorney here in Florida. And today we're going to be talking about waivers and releases and what you absolutely positively must make sure your release says before you sign it. So let's get started. So if you have any questions, you should have the GoToWebinar chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will answer any questions at the end, so you can put those questions in now. Please do not include the names of any people or companies in your questions. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the releases and what the various forms that they come in. We're going to look at several so you understand what they look like and how they work. We're going to talk about the one thing that you need to make sure happens with every release. We'll talk about conditional releases because those are very important. And then, of course, we will answer any questions that you have, and we'll go through some SunRay resources that will help you through this process. Okay, so let's talk about releases and why they are important. So first, it depends on if you are the GC or the sub, or a sub with a sub-sub. That's going to dictate what form of release you should be using. So as a subcontractor, you want to give away the least amount of rights possible, which means you're going to give a narrow release when you get a check, right? So understand, when you're a sub, you have lots of rights. You have contract rights, you have equitable rights, you have lien rights. When you get a check, you'd like to give up the fewest amount of those rights from a period of time, a scope, an equity perspective. But the converse is also true if you're the GC, right? If you're the GC and you're giving someone a check, or you're a sub giving a sub-sub or a supplier a check, you want to get the broadest release possible. You want to know that when you give someone a check and you get a release, that from that point back, they can't come back to you and ask for any amount of money, that we're done, okay? So that's why there are different forms of releases. It is very important that you understand that every release is governed by its terms, which means you have to read them. So let's talk about the statutory releases. These are what we would consider the default releases, the releases that exist in Florida Chapter 713, the statute. Okay, so here it is up on the screen. So it says, the undersigned lienor, in consideration of the sum of blank, some amount of money, hereby waives and releases its lien and right to claim a lien for labor, services, or materials furnished through, and you're going to put in a through date, to the name of your customer, on the job of, and you're going to insert the name of the owner, to the following property, and you're going to put in the address and description of the property. So this partial statutory waiver requires that you fill in all of that information. And again, the two most important pieces of information are the amount of money you're getting and the through date, the date through which this release is releasing your rights. At the bottom, notice that it says this waiver and release does not cover any retention or labor, services, or materials furnished after the date specified. The date specified is that through date. Okay, so that is the progress statutory release. Let's take a look at the final statutory release. It says the undersigned lienor, in consideration of the final payment in the amount of blank, hereby waives and releases its lien and right to claim a lien for labor, services, or materials furnished to, that's when you insert the name of your customer, on the job of, and you insert the name of the owner, to the following described property, where you're going to include the address and description of the property. Notice that it does not have a through date. And the reason is that this release is effective as of the day that you sign it. So if you sign it today, you're releasing all of your lien rights from today back. Also notice that it doesn't include that little catch-all statement that said it excludes retainage and it excludes lien rights that accrue in the future. So when you sign a final, just know that that final release is releasing all of your lien rights from that date back.
Alex, can you
Yes.
give maybe an example? Because all too often when people see these forms, again, it's very straightforward. However, can you give maybe a use case of amounts so that when people are trying to fill out these forms, they understand what they should not do ever?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So if we go back to this form, right, this is the statutory progress release form. So you want, if you're expecting a check for $30,000, you want to make sure that the amount that you fill in is $30,000, because that is the amount that you are receiving. I'll mention briefly about $10 because that comes up sometimes. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But the amount of money that you want to put in there is the amount of money that you are expecting. The through date is the date that that payment is represented through. And we're going to go into a great detail about that through date here in a minute. So I'm going to show you a third release form, and then we'll talk about how to fill all of these forms in. So here's another form. And you can see already that it has a lot more words, right? So it says now, the undersigned, in consideration of the sum of $10 and other good and valuable consideration, does hereby waive and release its lien rights. And here's an important part. Its lien and right to claim a lien, as well as any and all claims, change orders, works, materials, delays, fees, costs, losses, expenses, damages, or sums for the labor, services, or materials furnished for the improvements of the following described property. So notice that what it has done is it has broadened the releases that you're giving. You're not just releasing lien rights. The statutory lien release form just releases lien rights. You, however, can agree in your contract, or someone can hand you a release form that requires that you release lots of other rights. So if you have unexecuted change orders in the past, this release, because it says the word change orders as well as lots of other words, you are releasing those rights. So you need to be very cautious that when you sign a release that you read it. And when I say you read it, I don't mean you read the first release that you get. I mean you read every release every time you sign a release every month. It's a pain in the ass, but if someone changes the form of the release on the third pay request and adds other language to it, you may be giving up rights that you didn't know about because you read the first release that you signed it, and then every other release you just signed because you assume it's the same. This release also has a through date. And again, we're going to spend a bit more time talking about through dates. Now, interestingly, this release also has other things that it is making you affirm. So notice that this release form says that you warrant and represent that you've paid all your bills. It also says that you warrant that all work supplied by, through, or under it fully complies with the applicable contract documents. So be aware that sometimes people use release forms not only to release rights, but to get you to verify certain facts. And why do they want to do this? Because if it turns out those facts are not true, not only can they sue you for breach of contract, but now they have a document signed by you, sometimes multiple times over and over again, that is likely notarized, so it's under oath, and it may be used against you later. So be very careful about what your releases say. Now, you remember we talked about narrow releases and broad releases. So this is a very broad release. So this is the type of release form that you would like to get if you are an owner and you pay your GC. You'd like the GC to sign this. If you're a GC and you have subs, this is the type of release you want your subs to sign when you give them a check. If you're a sub, this is the type of release you want your sub to sign when you give them a check. Again, when you give someone a check and you get a release, this is the kind of release you want to get. Now, the converse again is also true. To the extent you are giving someone a release, you'd like not to give this release if you can avoid it, because you're giving up lots and lots of rights that you may need later. So how do you deal with this in the course of your dealings on a project? So the first step is, when you are asked to sign a contract, you need to make sure, does that contract include sample release forms that you're agreeing to sign every time you make a pay request? If so, you need to negotiate those forms of release. So for example, many contracts that are handed to you have lots of terms and conditions, have lots of exhibits. Usually it says somewhere in there, when you are going to submit your pay request, you're going to use the release form attached as Exhibit S. Well, you got to flip through, look at Exhibit S. Do you agree to sign that release form every time? Because if you sign a contract that says that that's the form you're going to use, well, that's what you have to use. Sometimes we also see contractors say that you will use a form that's acceptable to the GC. So that's a lazy way of doing it, which is to say they just put in that catch-all, and they may or may not include the form of release as well. So you have to be careful with that language. So one of the changes that we make to contracts when we review them is we add a sentence that says the parties agree that Chapter 713.20 forms of release shall be used for all partial and final release forms. They will be conditioned upon payment, and subcontractor may include exceptions in the release. Let me break down that sentence for you and why it is so important. Okay, so I showed you the statutory release forms. So those are the Chapter 713.20 forms. So those are the narrowest forms, generally speaking, that you can use. It just releases lien right. It has a payment amount, a through date, very simple. So this first part of the sentence, when you add this to your contract, says that's the form we're going to use. Next, it says they will be conditioned upon payment, right? You want to make sure that when you hand someone a release based on the promise of a check, and we'll talk about conditional releases in a moment, that release is not good until the check clears. It is possible, by the way, to sign a release that gives up all of your rights, and you may never even get any money. So you have to be careful. So the way you avoid that is to make all the releases conditional. Some contractors will, or owners will, reject conditional releases because some of their forms, their contracts say you have to give unconditional releases. Well, you know, if you have to give someone, if you have to get unconditional releases from your lower tiers, you have to pay them. So that means you are now advancing money on this job in order to get a release so that you can get paid. Everyone wants to use someone else's money if they can, someone else's credit. So if you can get your vendor to give you a conditional release, and then you add that to your release forms and you give that to the contractor, well, then that's fine. You haven't given any money for the conditional release. So you want to make sure that you have the right to use conditional releases. And then the last part is subcontractor may include exceptions in the release. So if you have a pending change order and it hasn't been approved, but you've already done all the work and you're owed an extra, $20,000, if you sign that broad form of release that I showed you, you likely will have given up your rights to that change order if there is a dispute, if someone wants to read those documents. So this gives you the right to add an exception. So you would add to the release an exception that says this release excludes pending change order 14 in the amount of $20,000. So you would exclude that from the release. Some contractors will not accept releases that have exclusions. So by including in your contract the right to include exceptions, then they can't object to that release when you submit it to get paid. So what is the one thing that you absolutely positively must do? You must match the through date with the dollars that you're getting. Remember, the through date is the effective date of your release. The through date is what controls over the payment amount. If the through date and the payment amount don't match, you need to change one or the other so they match. So let me explain what I mean. If you've done work for the month of June and you're owed $50,000 for that period of time, and now you are showing up to get paid, and they say, yeah, we're going to pay you $30,000 through June. Well, you have a problem, right? You know that June represents 50,000, not 30,000. So some people incorrectly believe, well, it's okay, it doesn't matter. I submitted a pay request that said 50. They're going to pay me 30. So that extra 20 is just going to get tagged on later. But if you sign a release in exchange and give up all of your rights through the end of June, and you only accepted 30,000, if we went to court, a judge will say, well, you decided to take 30 instead of 50 to release all your rights through June. That was a business decision you made. You signed this document and you gave up those rights. So you need to understand that the through date, which again is almost always the end of the month, is what is going to control. So if the through date and the money that you're getting don't match, you have to make them match. So let's go back to our scenario. You've done work through June, it's $50,000, they want to pay you 30. So you've got effectively two choices. One, you got to tell them, no, if you want to release through the end of June, you need to pay me 50. If they're not willing to do that, then the other option is to say, fine, you're only willing to pay me 30. Well, then that gets me through June 11th, June 22nd. You'll have to figure out which date represents the work through for $30,000 through that period of time in June. It's up to you. Again, maybe it's one delivery of materials, maybe it's everything but the last 2 days of work. I don't know. You have to figure that out. But if it's not 50, you have to make them match. If you don't, the through date will always control. So let's take a moment and talk about conditional releases. A conditional release is expressly conditioned upon payment when you don't have the money in hand, meaning it's a promise to pay. And by the way, that includes a check. A check is a promise to pay. It's an IOU from the bank. So if someone gives you a check, that check may not clear. So you can add language to your release, notwithstanding anything to the contrary. This waiver and release is conditioned upon and not effective until the undersigned receives paid funds of blank. So if we go back to our example, you're owed 50 grand and they are gonna give you a check, give you a credit card, because don't forget they can pull that back, promise that the check is in the mail. When you give them that release, you want to make it conditional on the receipt of the $50,000. That's what you would fill in the blank. Now keep in mind that sometimes we see releases that are titled conditional release, but when you read it, it doesn't have any condition in it. That's not a conditional release. So that's again why you have to read the release. You can never have a $10 conditional release. So if we look at my example and we put $10, you're not releasing your rights in June for $10. You're releasing it for $50,000. So you can never have a $10 conditional release. Now we have a tool that we're happy to send to you. It's called the Make Me Conditional stamp. You can go to makemeconditional.com. So the language that I just read to you, we have it on a stamp. We'll put it in the mail to you. So now when you get that release and you're getting ready to sign it, you can stamp it and it has a little blank where you can put the amount of money that you're expecting. And now you can take any release and you can make it conditional. So with that, Ariella, do we have any questions?
You know what, we do have a question. We have many customers who don't understand the $10 and come back to us annoyed that the full amount they paid isn't there. How do you personally handle this? And Alex, I think to answer this question, I think we should also explain that you could give a conditional release, and the whole rationale again behind the $10. Why is somebody asking for $10? If you want to answer it, I can answer it. We could both answer it. So it's a great question. Go ahead.
All right, so let me explain the $10. So the $10 is a legal fiction. It's a representation of some amount of money. And that typically it's one of a few scenarios. The $10 release is typically used most commonly when there's no money is changing hands, right? So you submitted a notice to owner. Someone needs a release from you because you sent a notice to owner. You didn't do any work or deliver any materials in that period, but they still need a release from you. That release is going to say $10. So that's scenario number one. Another scenario is people don't want that release to say how much you got paid because they know that release is going to keep going up the chain, and they don't want other people up the chain to start adding all the amounts and effectively reverse engineering what your bid was, what their bid was, right? Because if they add up all of the releases, they would see how much money people paid. So people like to hide how much they are paying by putting $10. The other reason is that sometimes you don't want to argue about how much someone got or should have gotten, and you just put $10. So our advice generally is if you are giving someone a check and getting a release, you're better off having the release say $10. And the reason is they show up and you're going to give them an $8,000 check and they think it should have been $10,000, right? We don't even have to have that argument if the release says $10, because if we go to court, the judge is going to say, well, did you get some amount of money? And the other side will say, well, I got 8, I was supposed to get 10. And the judge said, well, that's not what this says. This says you got some amount of money, and 8,000 sounds like some amount of money. So we're not going to argue about it anymore. Now, the converse is also true. If you are giving someone a release and getting a check, we recommend that you put down the amount, that you strike out the $10 and you put in how much you're actually getting, so that there's no misunderstanding about what amount of money you were expecting for that release. I'm not sure if that answered this person's question. What I can suggest is if it didn't, they can send us an email with maybe a few more details, and I'm happy to answer the question then. Any other questions, Ariella? Are you there?
Yes, I apologize. There was one other question by one person that your initials are C and W. It was accidentally removed. Would you be so kind as to ask that question again? It has to do with progress payments. If you could just copy and paste your question again.
Ariel, you want to run through these other slides while we wait for that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So SunRay has wonderful resources online. If you are a SunRay customer, you already know that you could do your waivers and releases for free when you do your notices to owners through our system. We also have these wonderful tools for you and for your sales team. The first one is a project information sheet. If you ever need to give your sales department, hey, this is what we need to do notices to owners. Can you please have this filled out? This is a wonderful way to get the information that you need to submit your notices to owners. We are in all 50 states. So if you have any questions, you can go online. Wonderful resource here to go in and see, okay, if I'm in the state of Texas, which notices do I send? Because each and every state has a different statutory requirement. And the third is our deadline calculator for all 50 states. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have that question. If our progress payment release does not specifically mention CO, but the CO work has completed during a through date, are we protected to collect the CO monies at a later date?
The question is not whether you did the work. The question is, do you have a signed change order? That's going to be the crux of the question that the court is going to look at. When you have a contract and someone says, hey, price and proceed this work, and you do it, but you don't have a fully executed agreement or change order, that work has not become part of your contract yet. And that is what the problem is. So that's what you need to exclude. You need to exclude from your release pending claims and unexecuted change orders. Once the change order is executed, whether the work was done or not, then it becomes part of your contract, becomes part of your pay request, becomes part of your billings. It becomes less of a problem. It kind of is subsumed in your contract. It's before it's a signed change order. So it's not the work, it's whether you have a signed change order or not.
Another mention from a credit manager stated, I don't like to accept conditional waivers from a subs vendor. If they don't follow up with payment after receiving a check, I won't know that until their vendor sends me a notice of non-payment.
That is a true statement. If you are the recipient of releases, meaning you're the one paying and someone else is giving you releases, you have to be careful when you receive conditional releases because of that exact fact, especially if they are more than one tier removed away from you, right? So it's easy to control the condition of payment when you are paying the person that gives you that condition, right? So if I'm a GC and my sub gives me a conditional release, I can look in my own checkbook and see, well, I got a $50,000 conditional release. Here's the check for $50,000. I met the condition. What you cannot do is when the subcontractor supplier passes up a conditional release and you give the $50,000, you don't know that that any portion of it got to the supplier. So what we normally require when we represent owners or GCs is that every month effectively 2 releases are provided. You're providing a conditional release for the current period, and at the exact same time you're providing an unconditional release from the prior period. So you only have a gap window of a month of not knowing, which is effectively the current month, because you're not going to pay them against a conditional release now if you don't also know that the prior month you have a unconditional. So that's what we typically recommend. It's twice as much work, unfortunately, but you would get 2 releases, a conditional for the current period and an unconditional from the prior period, and that solves the problem.
We have one last question that goes back to the change orders. So should we wait to sign the waiver until we have a signed change order?
No, because then you keep waiting for your money. What you need to do is just include an exception that says this release does not release change order request number 14 dated June 11th in the amount of $20,000. So if you just include an exception, then you know that by signing that release, that exception is outside of the release. You could wait if you wanted to, but now you're holding up undisputed money for a little piece of the disputed money. So that's my suggestion if the contractor will take it. So we do these webinars almost monthly. So our next one is, how do I get paid after recording a lien? That's on Thursday, August 21st. And then on September 18th, we have chargebacks and bad checks suck, then do this. We'll talk about how to deal with chargebacks and bad checks. You can sign up for all of these at sunraynotice.com/education. And we also are hosting a 1.5-hour in-person live masterclass on waivers and releases. You all got a little taste of it, but we're going to dive deep looking at lots of forms, how to fill them out, what to do, what not to do on October 16th in Miami. It's an hour and a half. We will answer all your questions. There will be no questions when anyone leaves about how to deal with releases once this seminar is done. This is you, Ariella.
If you enjoyed this waivers webinar, please take a moment, put your phone onto the QR code, and we would love to hear from you of the little lovely review. As you could see, I'm not very good at asking for these reviews, Alex. So thank you all for attending our webinar. We know that there could be additional questions. If you do have a question, feel free to send us an email. We are happy to answer any questions you may have. This is a very confusing topic. People can send you waivers all day, every day, and you have no idea sometimes if you're signing a final when it looks like it's a conditional. So feel free to email us at any time. And Alex, as always, such a spectacular job, and I wish everyone a sunny day.